You have clicked on this video perhaps because something within you recognizes that the mind you trust so completely may not be entirely your own. If that recognition has stirred, then know this: we are not here to engage in comfortable philosophical discussion or gentle self-help platitudes. No, we are here to confront a truth so fundamental, so shattering to our everyday assumptions, that once you truly grasp it, you will never again mistake the voice in your head for the totality of who you are. When I speak of thoughts, I do not speak of the casual mental chatter that occupies your daily awareness. I speak of something far more profound and disturbing. The autonomous complexes that think through you, the archetypal patterns that speak with your voice, the unconscious forces that masquerade as your personal opinions and beliefs. Carl Gustav Jung spent his life mapping this hidden landscape of the psyche, and what he discovered should terrify anyone who believes they are the master of their own mental domain. The thoughts you consider your own are often visitors from regions of the psyche you have never explored. They arise from depths you cannot fathom, carrying messages from sources you cannot identify, serving purposes you do not understand, and the most dangerous part, you experience them as absolutely, unquestionably yours. This is not mystical speculation. This is psychological fact, demonstrated again and again in Jung's clinical work and validated by decades of depth psychology research. Consider this: you sit quietly, attempting to meditate, and suddenly, a stream of worry floods your consciousness. Where did this worry originate? You assume it came from you, from some rational assessment of your circumstances. But Jung would ask a different question. What if this worry belongs to a complex that has been activated by something you cannot consciously perceive? What if the anxious voice is not your voice at all, but the voice of an autonomous psychological entity that has learned to speak through your nervous system? This is not theoretical. In my years of analytical practice, I have witnessed individuals whose thoughts were so clearly not their own that the distinction became impossible to ignore. A gentle, soft-spoken woman who suddenly erupts with violent fantasies that horrify her. A rational, logical man who finds himself obsessed with mystical imagery he claims to despise. A devoted mother who experiences intrusive thoughts of abandoning her family. Thoughts so foreign to her conscious values that she questions her sanity. In each case, what we were witnessing was not personal pathology, but the autonomous activity of the unconscious psyche. Jung called these psychological entities complexes, and he discovered that they possess a degree of independence that challenges our most basic assumptions about mental unity. They have their own emotional charge, their own memory systems, their own agenda, and they can think through you without your permission. But the complexes are only the beginning. Deeper still lie the archetypes, those primordial patterns of human experience that Jung described as the fundamental structures of the collective unconscious. When an archetype becomes activated in your psyche, it does not simply influence your thoughts, it begins to think through you. The mother archetype thinks maternal thoughts. The warrior archetype thinks strategic thoughts. The shadow archetype thinks forbidden thoughts. And you, in your conscious identification, believe these archetypal thoughts are your personal insights, your individual perspectives. This is where Jung's discovery becomes truly unsettling. The self you think you know, the unified consciousness you assume to be in control, is actually more like a committee of voices, a parliament of psychological entities, each with its own agenda, its own perspective, its own claim to truth. And the chairman of this committee, what you call your ego, often has far less authority than it imagines. I recall a dream that one of my patients brought to our sessions, a dream that perfectly illustrates this psychological reality. In the dream, he found himself in a vast library, but the books were not on shelves. They were floating in the air around him, opening and closing of their own accord. Each book spoke with a different voice, and he realized with growing horror that all these voices were claiming to be his thoughts. He reached for one book, hoping to gain control, but the moment he touched it, it began to read itself aloud, and the voice was his own, yet saying things he had never consciously thought. When he woke, he understood what his unconscious was trying to show him. The thoughts he considered his own were like those floating books, autonomous entities that spoke through him, but did not originate from his conscious will. This dream marked the beginning of his individuation process, the long and often difficult journey toward recognizing the multiplicity within the psyche. But here is where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary. Most people, when they encounter this multiplicity, either deny it or pathologize it. They assume that hearing different voices in the psyche is a sign of mental illness, something to be medicated or suppressed. Jung took a radically different approach. He suggested that the goal is not to eliminate these autonomous voices, but to develop a conscious relationship with them. This is the essence of what Jung called individuation, the process by which a person becomes aware of the various psychological entities operating within their psyche and learns to relate to them as distinct but interconnected aspects of the whole self. It is not about controlling these voices. That is impossible and ultimately destructive. It is about recognizing them, understanding their function, and integrating their wisdom into conscious awareness. When you begin to observe your thoughts from this perspective, everything changes. That sudden flash of anger is no longer just your anger. It may be the voice of your shadow expressing something you have been trying to suppress. That unexpected moment of tenderness is not just your kindness. It may be the anima or animus speaking, connecting you to qualities you have disowned. That persistent worry is not just your anxiety. It may be a parental complex, repeating patterns learned in childhood. This recognition is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it frees you from the burden of taking every thought personally, of assuming that every mental movement reflects your true nature. Terrifying because it reveals the extent to which what you consider your autonomous self is actually a collection of semi-autonomous processes, many of which operate beyond your conscious control. Jung discovered this not through abstract theorizing, but through direct confrontation with his own unconscious. In what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung deliberately engaged with the autonomous figures that appeared in his psyche, treating them not as symptoms or fantasies, but as genuine psychological entities with their own reality and intelligence. He would dialogue with these figures, argue with them, learn from them. He discovered that when approached with respect and curiosity, rather than fear and control, these autonomous aspects of the psyche often revealed profound wisdom. They were not random neural firings or pathological symptoms. They were purposeful expressions of the psyche's attempt to maintain balance and promote growth. One of the most significant figures Jung encountered during this period was what he came to call his number 2 personality, a wise, ancient presence that seemed to possess knowledge far beyond Jung's conscious understanding. This figure would speak through Jung's thoughts, offering insights and perspectives that his rational mind could never have generated. Initially, Jung was disturbed by this experience, fearing he was losing his sanity. But gradually, he came to understand that this was not pathology, but revelation, a glimpse into the deeper layers of the psyche where wisdom traditions and archetypal knowledge reside. This brings us to one of Jung's most radical discoveries. The thoughts you think are not simply products of your personal history and individual brain chemistry. Many of them arise from what he called the collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche that contains the accumulated wisdom and experience of humanity itself. When archetypal patterns become activated in your psyche, you gain access to knowledge and insights that extend far beyond your personal learning. But this access comes with a price, the realization that your thoughts are not entirely your own. When the wise old man archetype thinks through you, offering profound insights, can you claim credit for that wisdom? When the trickster archetype generates clever solutions to problems, is that your creativity? When the shadow archetype reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature, is that your perception? Jung's answer was both humbling and empowering. He suggested that the ego's role is not to be the source of all wisdom and creativity, but rather to serve as a conscious mediator between the various archetypal forces operating within the psyche. The individuated person does not control these forces. They collaborate with them. They learn to recognize when an archetype is speaking and to consciously engage with that archetypal wisdom rather than being unconsciously possessed by it. This collaboration requires a fundamental shift in how we understand the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. Most people operate from what Jung called ego consciousness, the assumption that the conscious mind is the captain of the psychological ship, with everything else serving as crew. But Jung's work revealed that consciousness is more like a small island in a vast ocean of unconscious processes, and the health of the whole system depends on maintaining respectful communication between the island and the ocean. When this shift in understanding occurs, when you begin to recognize that your thoughts emerge from multiple sources within the psyche, the very foundation of your reality begins to tremble. The comfortable illusion that you are a unified, coherent self dissolves, revealing something far more complex and magnificent. A living constellation of psychological forces, each contributing its voice to the symphony of consciousness. But do not mistake this for chaos. There is profound intelligence in this multiplicity, an organic wisdom that your rational mind cannot grasp. The psyche operates according to principles that predate logic, following patterns that connect you to the deepest currents of human experience. When you begin to listen, truly listen, to these various voices within, you discover that each carries a fragment of truth that your conscious mind, in its limited perspective, could never access alone. I have worked with individuals who spent years in therapy trying to understand why they could not control their thoughts, why certain patterns of thinking persisted despite their best conscious efforts to change them. The breakthrough inevitably came, not when they gained control, but when they recognized that these persistent thoughts belonged to autonomous complexes that required acknowledgement, not domination. There was a man who came to me tormented by what he called his inner critic, a voice so harsh and unrelenting that it had driven him to the edge of despair. For months, we worked together to identify the source of this voice. Through careful analysis of his dreams and active imagination exercises, we discovered that this critic was not his voice at all, but the internalized voice of his father's father, a complex that had formed around generations of unexpressed shame and perfectionism. Once he recognized this voice as an autonomous entity rather than his own judgment, everything changed. He could dialogue with it, understand its fears, acknowledge its protective function, while refusing to be tyrannized by its demands. The voice did not disappear. Complexes rarely do. But its power over his conscious awareness diminished dramatically. He learned to say, "I hear you, but I am not you." This is the paradox Jung discovered. The path to psychological freedom lies not in controlling your thoughts, but in recognizing which thoughts are truly yours and which belong to these other voices within the psyche. But how can you make this distinction? How can you separate your authentic voice from the chorus of complexes, archetypes, and internalized others that speak through your mental processes? The answer lies in what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. When a thought arises, instead of immediately identifying with it or rejecting it, you learn to hold it in conscious awareness while asking, what is the source of this thought? What psychological force is expressing itself through my mind right now? This requires a quality of attention that most people have never developed, the ability to observe your own psychological processes without being consumed by them. Consider the thoughts that arise when you are alone with yourself. when the distractions of daily life fall away. In those quiet moments, what voices emerge? Often, it is not your authentic voice, but the voices of anxiety, self-doubt, grandiosity, or compulsive planning. These are not random mental noise. They are expressions of complexes that have been activated by your solitude, each carrying its own emotional charge and agenda. The anxious voice may belong to a complex formed around early experiences of abandonment or threat. It speaks through your thoughts, generating endless scenarios of potential danger, not because you are actually in danger, but because this complex has been programmed to scan for threats as a survival mechanism. The grandiose voice may emerge from a complex organized around compensation for feelings of inadequacy, generating thoughts of specialness and superiority to counterbalance deep-seated shame. When you recognize these voices as autonomous rather than personal, you gain the ability to relate to them consciously. You can acknowledge the anxiety complex without being overwhelmed by its catastrophic projections. You can hear the grandiose complex without inflating your ego with its fantasies of superiority. This conscious relationship is what Jung meant by individuation, not the elimination of these psychological forces, but their integration into a larger, more complete sense of self. But the process goes deeper still. As you develop this capacity to recognize autonomous voices within your psyche, you begin to encounter what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that emerges when conscious awareness maintains tension between opposing forces within the psyche. This function has the remarkable ability to generate insights and solutions that neither consciousness alone nor the unconscious alone could produce. I recall a patient who struggled for years with a creative block that left her unable to write, despite her deep longing to express herself through words. In our work together, we discovered that her conscious mind held rigid ideas about what constituted good writing, while her unconscious was bursting with wild, unconventional imagery that her conscious mind rejected as unworthy. The conflict between these two positions had created a psychological stalemate. Through active imagination and dream work, she learned to dialogue between these opposing voices, the perfectionist critic and the chaotic creator. Neither voice was wrong. Each carried essential wisdom. The critic understood craft and structure. The creator understood inspiration and authenticity. When she stopped trying to choose between them and instead held both in conscious awareness, something new emerged. A writing voice that was both disciplined and free, both crafted and spontaneous. This is the transcendent function in action. The psyche's innate ability to generate novel solutions when consciousness learns to work with, rather than against, the multiplicity within. But accessing this function requires courage, because it demands that you release your identification with any single voice within the psyche, and instead become what Jung called the one who knows, the witnessing consciousness that can observe all voices without being possessed by any of them. This witnessing consciousness is not another voice among many. It is the center from which all voices can be perceived and integrated. Jung sometimes called this the self with a capital S, distinguishing it from the ego self that most people mistake for their total identity. The ego is simply one voice in the psychological parliament. The self is the chamber in which all voices can be heard and harmonized. But do not imagine that reaching this witnessing consciousness is a comfortable achievement. It requires what Jung called the death of the ego. Not literal death, but the death of the illusion that you are identical with your thoughts, emotions, and psychological patterns. This death is often experienced as a profound disorientation, a dark night of the soul in which all your familiar landmarks dissolve. Many people, when they first glimpse the multiplicity within their psyche, experience what Jung termed the fear of going mad. If I am not the author of my thoughts, they wonder, then who am I? If these voices within me have their own agenda, how can I trust anything I think or feel? This fear is natural and necessary. It signals the beginning of a deeper awakening to the true nature of consciousness. Jung himself went through this dissolution during his confrontation with the unconscious. He described periods when he felt as though he were menaced by a psychosis, as the boundaries between his conscious mind and the autonomous contents of his unconscious began to blur. But rather than retreating from this experience, he chose to go deeper, to meet these autonomous forces directly and learn from them. What he discovered revolutionized not only his understanding of psychology, but his entire worldview. The voices and figures that emerged from his unconscious were not symptoms of mental illness, but expressions of a deeper intelligence, what he came to recognize as the self attempting to guide his development toward greater wholeness. This guidance does not come in the form of clear, rational instructions. It emerges through symbols, dreams, synchronicities, and those very autonomous thoughts that initially seem so threatening. The psyche speaks in a language older than words, communicating through images and feelings that bypass rational understanding and strike directly at the heart of meaning. When you learn to listen to this deeper language, when you develop what Jung called symbolic attitude, your relationship to your thoughts undergoes a fundamental transformation. You no longer need to believe every thought that arises, nor do you need to suppress thoughts that disturb you. Instead, you can receive them as communications from the deeper layers of your psyche, each carrying information about the current state of your psychological development. That disturbing thought about harming someone you love is not evidence of your hidden evil. It may be the shadow complex attempting to balance an overly idealized self-image. That sudden urge to abandon everything and disappear is not proof of your irresponsibility. It may be the transcendent function signaling that your current life structure has become too rigid, too removed from your authentic nature. This symbolic understanding requires a radical shift in how you relate to mental content. Most people exist in what Jung called literal consciousness. They take their thoughts at face value, assuming that a worried thought means there is something to worry about, that an angry thought means they are angry, that a loving thought means they are loving. But Jung discovered that thoughts often function symbolically, pointing not to external realities, but to internal psychological dynamics that require attention. I once worked with a businessman who was tormented by recurring fantasies of violence against his colleagues. These thoughts appalled him because he considered himself a peaceful, ethical person. Traditional therapy had focused on managing these intrusive thoughts, treating them as unwanted symptoms to be controlled. But when we approached them symbolically, a different picture emerged. Through careful exploration, we discovered that these violent fantasies were not literal desires, but symbolic expressions of his suppressed rage at being trapped in a corporate environment that violated his deepest values. His conscious mind had adapted so completely to this toxic situation that it could no longer perceive the violence being done to his soul. The violent thoughts were his psyche's way of communicating the urgency of his situation, not through literal violence, but through symbolic imagery that could penetrate his psychological defenses. Once he understood this symbolic language, he could address the real issue, not the thoughts themselves, but the soul-destroying compromise he was making in his daily life. The violent fantasies gradually diminished as he took concrete steps to align his external circumstances with his authentic values. The thoughts had served their purpose. They had broken through his psychological numbness and delivered their message. This is the intelligence of the unconscious at work. It does not speak in the polite, rational language of consciousness. It speaks in symbols, symptoms, and what appear to be irrational mental intrusions. But when you learn to decode this symbolic language, you discover that what seemed like psychological pathology was actually psychological wisdom attempting to guide you toward greater wholeness. Jung called this process the intelligence of the unconscious, and he discovered that it operates according to a logic far more sophisticated than rational thought. While consciousness thinks in linear sequences, cause and effect, problem and solution, the unconscious thinks in patterns, connections, and meaningful coincidences that reveal the hidden order underlying apparent chaos. This is why the thoughts that disturb you most may be the ones carrying the most important information. The psyche has a compensatory function. It generates content that balances whatever attitude is dominating consciousness. If you have become too controlled, it will generate thoughts of chaos. If you have become too rational, it will generate irrational impulses. If you have become too nice, it will generate aggressive fantasies. This compensatory mechanism is not random. It is the psyche's attempt to maintain psychological equilibrium. But if you do not recognize this function, if you take these compensatory thoughts literally rather than symbolically, you will either be overwhelmed by them or spend enormous energy trying to suppress them. Both responses miss the point entirely. The goal is not to eliminate these compensatory thoughts, but to understand what they are compensating for. What aspect of your conscious attitude has become too one-sided? What qualities are you suppressing that are now demanding expression through autonomous thoughts and impulses? This inquiry requires honest self-examination because the thoughts that disturb you most often point to the qualities you most need to integrate. But integration does not mean acting on every impulse or thought that arises. Jung was very clear about this distinction. To integrate the shadow does not mean to become destructive. It means to acknowledge destructive impulses consciously, so they do not operate unconsciously. To integrate the anima or animus does not mean to become possessed by romantic fantasies. It means to recognize these archetypal energies so they can inform rather than inflate your relationships. This integration process requires what Jung called active imagination, a technique for engaging consciously with the autonomous contents of the psyche. Rather than being passively overwhelmed by disturbing thoughts or trying desperately to control them, you learn to enter into dialogue with the psychological forces they represent. I guided one patient through an active imagination exercise with her inner critic, the harsh voice that had dominated her thoughts for decades. Instead of fighting this voice or accepting its judgments, I encouraged her to visualize it as a separate entity and ask it directly what it wanted from her. What emerged was not the monster she had imagined, but a frightened, childlike figure who had taken on the role of protector, believing that harsh self-criticism would prevent her from making mistakes that might lead to abandonment. Once she could see this complex clearly, once she understood its protective function, she could relate to it with compassion rather than fear. She could acknowledge its concerns while refusing to be tyrannized by its methods. The critical voice did not disappear, but its grip on her consciousness loosened dramatically. She had transformed an autonomous complex from an unconscious possession into a conscious relationship. This transformation, from unconscious possession to conscious relationship, is the essence of psychological development, according to Jung. It is not about becoming perfect or eliminating all psychological difficulties. It is about becoming conscious of the forces operating within your psyche so you can relate to them as a mature adult, rather than being controlled by them like a helpless child. But this maturation process reveals another unsettling truth. The more conscious you become of the multiplicity within your psyche, the more you realize how little control you actually have over the contents of consciousness. You cannot decide what thoughts will arise, what dreams will visit you, what emotions will surge through your body. These processes operate according to their own intelligence, their own timing, their own purpose. This realization can be profoundly disturbing for the ego, which is accustomed to believing itself the executive director of psychological life. But Jung discovered that this loss of control is actually a gain in wisdom. When you stop trying to control the contents of consciousness, and instead learn to relate to them skillfully, you tap into resources far beyond your personal capacity. The thoughts that arise from the collective unconscious carry wisdom accumulated over millennia of human experience. The insights that emerge from the transcendent function often solve problems that rational thinking cannot touch. The guidance that comes through dreams and synchronicities frequently points toward possibilities that your conscious mind could never imagine. But accessing this deeper intelligence requires what Jung called a sacrifice of the ego, the willingness to admit that your conscious understanding is limited, that there are forces within you wiser than your rational mind. This sacrifice is not self-destruction, it is self-transcendence. You do not eliminate the ego, but rather expand your identity to include the larger self, of which the ego is only one part. This expanded identity changes everything. You no longer need to defend every thought as if it were your personal possession. You no longer need to be ashamed of every dark impulse as if it revealed your true nature. You can observe the play of psychological forces within your consciousness with the same fascination. You might feel watching weather patterns move across a vast landscape. From this perspective, the question is not whether you can trust your thoughts, but whether you can develop a mature relationship with the source from which thoughts arise. Can you listen to the voice of anxiety without being consumed by its catastrophic scenarios? Can you hear the whisper of your unlived life without abandoning your current responsibilities? Can you acknowledge the shadow's harsh truths without losing your capacity for compassion? These questions cannot be answered theoretically. They must be lived, experienced, embodied through the difficult work of psychological development. Jung called this work the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, because it requires going against the natural tendency to identify unconsciously with whatever psychological content happens to be dominating consciousness at any given moment. Instead of this unconscious identification, you learn to maintain what Jung called the transcendent standpoint, a position of consciousness that can witness all psychological contents without being possessed by any of them. This standpoint is not achieved through detachment or spiritual bypassing, but through the patient work of making conscious relationship with each autonomous complex and archetypal pattern that operates within your psyche. The irony is profound. The more you recognize that your thoughts are not entirely your own, the more you discover who you actually are. Beneath the cacophony of autonomous voices, beneath the conflicting demands of various complexes, beneath the archetypal patterns that think through you, there emerges a quality of awareness that Jung called the self. Not another content of consciousness, but the very capacity for consciousness itself. This self is both personal and transpersonal, both individual and universal. It is the you that existed before you learned to think, and it will remain when all thinking ceases. It is the witness that observes all thoughts without being limited by any particular thought. It is the space in which all psychological contents arise and pass away. When you begin to identify with this deeper self, rather than with the stream of thoughts and emotions that move through consciousness, you discover a freedom that no external circumstance can touch. You are no longer at the mercy of every autonomous thought or complex that arises. You can engage with these psychological forces consciously, learning from them while maintaining your essential autonomy. But this freedom comes with responsibility. Once you recognize the power of autonomous complexes and archetypal patterns, you cannot claim innocence about their effects in your life and relationships. You cannot blame your behavior entirely on unconscious forces while simultaneously claiming credit for your conscious achievements. You must own the totality of your psychological functioning, including those aspects that operate beyond your direct control. This ownership is not self-blame but self-acceptance, the mature recognition that you are a complex psychological system containing both conscious and unconscious elements, both personal and transpersonal dimensions. You are simultaneously the author of your choices and the vessel through which larger forces express themselves. This paradox cannot be resolved through logical analysis. It can only be lived with wisdom and humility. This ownership transforms your relationship not only to your thoughts, but to your entire existence. You begin to understand that what you call your life is actually a collaborative creation between your conscious will and forces far beyond your personal control. The career you chose may have been guided by archetypal patterns you never recognized. The person you married may have been selected by complexes seeking completion. The crises you have faced may have been orchestrated by the self's drive toward wholeness. This recognition can initially feel overwhelming. If so much of what you believed was your autonomous decision-making was actually the result of unconscious forces, what does that say about your agency, your responsibility, your very identity? Jung faced this same crisis during his own psychological descent, and what he discovered offers a profound reorientation to the question of free will. The answer lies not in denying these unconscious influences, but in developing what Jung called conscious participation with them. You cannot control the archetypal currents that move through your psyche, but you can learn to navigate them skillfully. You cannot eliminate the complexes that think through you, but you can develop a mature relationship with them. You cannot dictate what thoughts will arise, but you can choose how to respond to them. This conscious participation requires a quality of attention that most people never develop. It demands that you learn to observe your psychological processes with the same careful attention a sailor gives to wind patterns and ocean currents. The sailor cannot control the weather, but through careful observation and skillful response, they can work with natural forces rather than against them. I have watched this transformation occur in countless individuals who initially came to therapy seeking to control their troubling thoughts. A woman tormented by obsessive worries about her children's safety discovered that these thoughts belonged to an activated mother complex, rooted in her own childhood experiences of abandonment. Rather than fighting these worries or dismissing them as irrational, she learned to dialogue with the frightened mother within her, acknowledging its protective concerns while refusing to be paralyzed by its catastrophic scenarios. The obsessive thoughts did not disappear overnight, but their compulsive quality began to fade as she developed a conscious relationship with their source. She could recognize when the mother complex was activated and respond to it with understanding rather than panic. "I see you are afraid," she would say to this inner voice. "What are you trying to protect?" This simple shift from unconscious possession to conscious dialogue transformed her experience entirely. But the process goes deeper than managing individual complexes. As you develop this capacity for conscious participation with unconscious contents, you begin to perceive patterns that extend far beyond your personal psychology. You start to notice how certain thoughts and emotions arise, not just from your individual history, but from collective currents that are moving through the culture, the family system, even the species itself. Jung discovered that the psyche is not a closed system, but an open field that participates in what he called the psychic atmosphere of the collective. Just as your body exists within and is influenced by the physical environment, your psyche exists within and is influenced by the collective unconscious. The thoughts that arise in your consciousness may be responding to tensions and developments in this larger psychic field. This understanding radically expands the question of psychological responsibility. When you experience sudden waves of anxiety, depression, or rage that seem disproportionate to your personal circumstances, you might ask not only, what complex has been activated in me, but also, what is happening in the collective that my psyche is responding to? This does not excuse unconscious behavior, but it provides a larger context for understanding the forces that influence your psychological state. I recall working with a patient during a particularly turbulent period in our society's political landscape. He came to sessions feeling inexplicably agitated, filled with thoughts of conflict and division that seemed to arise from nowhere. Through careful exploration, we discovered that his psyche was resonating with the collective shadow that was being activated in the culture. The projection of evil onto political opponents, the dehumanization of those with different viewpoints. His personal psychology contained complexes that made him particularly susceptible to these collective currents. Childhood experiences of family conflict had created an internal complex organized around the fear of division and the compulsive need to maintain harmony. When this personal complex encountered the collective activation of the shadow archetype, it generated the agitated thoughts that were disturbing his peace of mind. Understanding this connection allowed him to respond more consciously to both his personal psychology and the collective influences affecting him. He could recognize when his harmony complex was being triggered by collective shadow projections and choose not to participate unconsciously in the cultural hysteria. This is psychological maturity, the ability to maintain your center while the world around you loses its balance. But this maturity comes with a sobering recognition. If your thoughts are influenced by forces beyond your personal control, then so are the thoughts of everyone around you. The person who cuts you off in traffic may be possessed by a rage complex activated by pressures they do not understand. The colleague who undermines you at work may be driven by an inferiority complex that operates entirely outside their conscious awareness. The family member who repeatedly triggers you may be unconsciously expressing an archetypal pattern that has nothing to do with their personal intentions. This understanding can generate either cynicism or compassion. If everyone is partially unconscious, partially possessed by autonomous complexes and archetypal forces, then how can we hold anyone truly responsible for their actions? Jung's answer to this question reveals the ethical dimension of depth psychology. Consciousness is not just a personal luxury, but a moral obligation. The more conscious you become of the forces operating within your own psyche, the greater your responsibility to prevent these forces from causing harm to others. You cannot claim innocence about your psychological impact once you recognize the power of unconscious projection, complex activation, and archetypal possession. With consciousness comes the obligation to contain your psychological contents, rather than unconsciously inflicting them on the world. This containment is not suppression. It is conscious relationship. When you feel the surge of an activated complex, when archetypal energies begin to possess your thoughts and emotions, the mature response is not to act them out unconsciously, but to hold them in conscious awareness until their meaning becomes clear. This requires what Jung called holding the tension, the ability to contain psychological energy without premature discharge. Most people, when gripped by strong psychological contents, either explode outward in unconscious action or implode inward in self-destructive behavior. The individuated person learns a third option: to hold the energy consciously while it transforms itself through the natural intelligence of the psyche. This holding is not passive endurance, but active participation in the psychological process. I have witnessed this transformation countless times in therapeutic work. A patient arrives in session consumed by rage at their partner, absolutely certain that their anger is justified and that action must be taken immediately. But when encouraged to hold this rage in conscious awareness, to explore its deeper roots and symbolic meaning, something remarkable often occurs. The rage begins to transform itself, revealing beneath its surface other emotions: hurt, fear, longing, that point toward the real issue that needs to be addressed. This transformation does not happen through rational analysis, but through what Jung called the symbolic attitude, the willingness to treat psychological contents as meaningful communications from the deeper layers of the psyche rather than simply as problems to be solved or emotions to be expressed. When you can hold anger symbolically, it may reveal itself as a guardian of violated boundaries. When you can hold depression symbolically, it may show itself as the psyche's attempt to force a necessary descent into deeper truth. But developing this symbolic attitude requires a fundamental shift in your relationship to psychological pain. Most people relate to difficult emotions as enemies to be defeated or unwanted visitors to be expelled as quickly as possible. Jung discovered that these difficult emotions often carry the most important information about what needs to change in your life. They are not obstacles to psychological development, but essential aspects of the individuation process. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of Jung's psychology to accept. The idea that psychological suffering is not simply something to be eliminated, but something to be understood. Not all suffering is meaningful. Some is simply the result of poor choices or unfortunate circumstances. But much of what we experience as psychological distress is actually the psyche's way of signaling that something needs to change, that some aspect of our current way of being has become inadequate to our deeper nature. The thoughts that torment you, the emotions that overwhelm you, the patterns that seem to control you, all of these may be communications from the self, attempting to guide you toward greater wholeness. But receiving these communications requires a radical reorientation to the purpose of psychological life. Instead of seeking comfort and control, you must learn to seek meaning and growth, even when that growth requires passing through periods of confusion and discomfort. This reorientation reveals another layer of Jung's revolutionary insight. The goal of psychological development is not happiness, but completeness. The individuated person is not someone who has eliminated all psychological difficulties, but someone who has developed a conscious relationship with the full spectrum of human experience. They can hold both light and shadow, both strength and vulnerability, both certainty and doubt, without being overwhelmed by any single aspect. This completeness is not a static achievement, but a dynamic process. The psyche continues to generate new contents, new challenges, new opportunities for growth throughout the entire lifespan. The thoughts that disturb you today may be preparing you for developments that will not fully manifest for years to come. The dreams that puzzle you now may be offering guidance for decisions you have not yet recognized you need to make. Jung called this the prospective function of the unconscious, its ability to perceive potentials and possibilities that consciousness can't yet grasp. The autonomous thoughts and images that arise from the deeper layers of the psyche often point not to where you have been, but to where you are going. They offer glimpses of unlived possibilities, unrealized potentials, undeveloped aspects of your nature that are seeking expression, but accessing this perspective wisdom requires patience and trust. You must learn to sit with psychological contents that make no immediate sense, to allow the meaning to emerge gradually, rather than demanding instant understanding. This patience is particularly challenging in a culture that expects immediate gratification and quick solutions to complex problems. The individuation process operates on its own timeline, following rhythms that cannot be rushed or controlled. Just as physical healing requires time for tissues to regenerate and wounds to close, psychological healing requires time for new patterns to establish themselves and old wounds to integrate their lessons. The thoughts that seem random or disturbing today may reveal their purpose months or even years from now. I remember working with a patient who was plagued by recurring dreams of being chased through dark forests by unseen predators. These dreams generated anxious thoughts that dominated her waking consciousness, filling her with dread and foreboding that she could not rationally explain. For months, we explored these images without finding clear meaning or resolution. Then, 2 years later, she faced a crisis at work that required her to confront corruption and abuse of power in her organization. As she prepared to blow the whistle on illegal activities, she suddenly understood the meaning of those earlier dreams. Her unconscious had been preparing her for this confrontation, showing her that she would need to navigate dangerous territory where powerful predators lurked in the shadows. The anxiety she had experienced was not pathological, but prophetic. Her psyche's way of preparing her for a challenge that would require all her courage and skill. The dreams had been training exercises, helping her develop the psychological resources she would need when the time came to act with integrity, despite significant personal risk. This prospective function of the unconscious reveals another dimension of why you cannot trust your thoughts in the conventional sense. The thoughts and images that arise from the deeper layers of the psyche often point toward futures that your rational mind cannot imagine. They operate according to a logic of possibility rather than probability, revealing potentials that exist in seed form within the current situation. When you learn to recognize this prospective dimension of psychological contents, your relationship to uncertainty begins to change. Instead of experiencing unclear thoughts and confusing emotions as problems to be solved, you can receive them as information about emerging possibilities. This does not mean becoming passive or fatalistic, but rather developing what Jung called active receptivity, the ability to engage consciously with the unknown rather than defending against it. This active receptivity requires a fundamental shift in how you understand the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. Most people treat the unconscious as either an enemy to be controlled or a friend to be trusted blindly. Jung discovered that the unconscious is neither enemy nor friend, but something far more complex, an autonomous partner in the process of psychological development. Like any partnership, the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious requires negotiation, communication, and mutual respect. You cannot dictate terms to the unconscious, but neither should you surrender your conscious discrimination to its autonomous processes. The goal is to develop what Jung called a creative relationship between these two fundamental aspects of the psyche. This creative relationship is what allows the transcendent function to operate, that mysterious psychological mechanism that generates novel solutions by combining conscious intention with unconscious wisdom. But accessing this function requires accepting a fundamental paradox. You must simultaneously take responsibility for your psychological development while acknowledging that much of that development occurs through processes beyond your direct control. The thoughts that arise in your consciousness are the meeting place where these conscious and unconscious forces encounter each other. By learning to observe this meeting with careful attention, by developing the capacity to hold the tension between known and unknown, between intention and inspiration, you become a conscious participant in your own psychological evolution. This participation is not comfortable. It requires living with uncertainty, holding questions that may never receive complete answers, acting on insights that cannot be fully validated through rational analysis. But it offers something that no amount of control or certainty can provide: the possibility of becoming who you truly are, rather than remaining trapped in who you think you should be. The thoughts you cannot trust are often the ones pointing toward this authentic self, the self that exists beneath the layers of social conditioning, family expectations, and personal identifications that have accumulated over the years. These authentic impulses may seem dangerous because they threaten the carefully constructed identity you have built to navigate the world safely. But Jung discovered that this constructed identity, what he called the persona, is ultimately a prison that prevents you from accessing your deeper creative and spiritual potentials. The thoughts that disturb the persona's comfortable assumptions are often messages from the self, calling you toward a more complete expression of your essential nature. This calling cannot be ignored indefinitely. The self has its own agenda, its own timeline, its own methods of getting your attention. If you refuse to listen to its gentle whispers, it may resort to louder communications, symptoms, crises, relationship breakdowns, career failures, whatever it takes to break through your psychological defenses and force you to pay attention to what needs to change. The autonomous thoughts that seem to arise from nowhere are often early warnings in this process, subtle communications that can help you make necessary adjustments before more dramatic interventions become necessary. Learning to listen to these communications, to treat them as meaningful rather than random, is one of the most important skills you can develop for navigating the complexities of psychological life. But listening does not mean believing everything you hear. The voices within the psyche, like voices in the external world, vary in their wisdom, their motives, and their reliability. Some autonomous thoughts arise from wounded complexes that are stuck in outdated patterns. Others emerge from archetypal wisdom that connects you to the deepest sources of human understanding. The challenge is developing the discrimination to tell the difference. This discrimination cannot be learned from books or theories. It must be developed through direct experience, through the patient work of engaging with your own psychological contents over time. You learn to recognize the different qualities of various inner voices, the different energetic signatures of complexes and archetypes, the different effects they have on your body, your emotions, your sense of clarity and purpose. Gradually, you develop what Jung called psychological discernment, the ability to evaluate psychological contents based not on their surface appearance, but on their deeper effects and intentions. This discernment allows you to engage selectively with the autonomous voices within your psyche, learning from those that offer genuine wisdom while maintaining boundaries with those that seek to possess or manipulate you. This discernment becomes particularly crucial when you encounter what Jung called the false prophets of the psyche, those inner voices that speak with apparent authority but serve hidden agendas. These voices often masquerade as wisdom, offering insights that seem profound, but actually serve to maintain psychological stagnation or inflate the ego's sense of specialness. They may present themselves as spiritual guidance, creative inspiration, or moral authority. But their true function is to prevent the genuine transformation that individuation requires. I recall a patient who became convinced that his recurring thoughts about leaving his family were divine messages calling him to a higher spiritual path. These thoughts arrived with such intensity and apparent clarity that he felt certain they represented authentic guidance from his deeper self. But when we explored the psychological context from which these thoughts emerged, a different picture revealed itself. These impulses arose not from genuine spiritual calling, but from an activated puer aeternus complex, the eternal child archetype that refuses the responsibilities of adult life in favor of perpetual seeking and spiritual inflation. This complex had learned to speak in the language of transcendence, but its actual agenda was escape from the difficult work of psychological maturation that his marriage and family demanded. The discrimination between authentic self-guidance and complex possession required months of careful exploration. We had to examine not just the content of these thoughts, but their psychological source, their effects on his capacity for genuine relationship, their alignment with his deeper values versus his unconscious fantasies. Gradually, he learned to recognize the difference between the voice of genuine transformation and the voice of spiritual bypassing. This process revealed something crucial about the nature of authentic inner guidance. It rarely offers easy answers or comfortable solutions. The genuine voice of the self typically calls you toward greater responsibility, not less, toward deeper engagement with life's difficulties, not escape from them, toward the integration of rejected aspects of yourself, not the inflation of preferred identities. But recognizing authentic guidance requires confronting a disturbing truth. The psyche contains voices that actively resist individuation, that prefer the familiar prison of unconscious patterns to the uncertain freedom of psychological development. These voices may speak with your own inner tone, using your own vocabulary and emotional signature, making them nearly impossible to distinguish from your authentic thoughts without careful discernment. Jung discovered that these resistances are not random obstacles, but intelligent forces with their own psychological purpose. They serve to test the strength of your commitment to growth, to ensure that you do not proceed toward greater consciousness without adequate preparation. Like guardians at the threshold of transformation, they challenge every step forward, demanding that you prove your readiness for each new level of awareness. The thoughts that arise during periods of potential transformation are particularly suspect. When you stand at the edge of significant life changes, career transitions, relationship developments, spiritual awakenings, the psyche generates a chorus of conflicting voices, each claiming to offer the correct path forward. Some urge caution, others demand immediate action. Some speak of practical concerns, others of transcendent possibilities. Some whisper of safety, others scream of adventure. These conflicting voices are not evidence of psychological confusion, but signs of a healthy individuation process. The psyche is presenting you with the full spectrum of possible responses to ensure that your eventual choice emerges from conscious consideration rather than unconscious compulsion. But navigating this cacophony requires the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without being overwhelmed by any single voice. This capacity for what Jung called holding the opposites is one of the most challenging aspects of psychological development. It requires maintaining conscious awareness while contradictory forces pull you in different directions, resisting the natural tendency to resolve tension through premature action or unconscious identification with one side of the conflict. Most people, when faced with such psychological tension, either make impulsive decisions to escape the discomfort or become paralyzed by the impossibility of choosing between conflicting options. But Jung discovered a third possibility: remaining conscious within the tension until something new emerges, a solution that transcends the original opposition by integrating elements from both sides. This transcendent solution cannot be manufactured through rational thinking or willful determination. It emerges spontaneously when consciousness maintains its position between the opposites long enough for the psyche's natural intelligence to generate novel possibilities. But this emergence requires a quality of patience that our culture actively discourages: the willingness to live with unresolved questions until their answers ripen naturally. I witnessed this process with a woman torn between her successful corporate career and her deep longing to pursue artistic expression. For months, her thoughts oscillated between these two possibilities, each seeming to negate the other. The corporate voice spoke of security, responsibility, and practical achievement. The artistic voice whispered of authenticity, creativity, and soul fulfillment. Both voices seemed to carry legitimate wisdom, making any simple choice feel like a betrayal of essential aspects of herself. Rather than forcing a decision, she learned to hold both voices in conscious awareness, allowing the tension to work its transformation within her psyche. Gradually, a third option began to emerge: not compromise, but genuine synthesis. She discovered possibilities for integrating her business skills with her artistic vision in ways that neither voice had initially suggested. The solution arose not from choosing between opposites, but from finding the creative tension that could hold both. This process revealed another layer of why conventional approaches to thought management fail so completely. Most psychological techniques attempt to resolve inner conflict by strengthening one voice and suppressing others, by choosing sides in the internal dialogue rather than facilitating genuine communication between different aspects of the psyche. But Jung discovered that psychological health requires the conscious coexistence of opposing tendencies, not their elimination. The goal is not to become internally consistent, but to become internally complete, capable of holding the full range of human experience without being possessed by any single aspect. This completeness includes what Jung called the inferior function, those aspects of your psychological makeup that remain undeveloped, clumsy, and potentially embarrassing. Most people spend enormous energy trying to hide or improve their inferior qualities. But Jung discovered that these rejected aspects often contain the keys to psychological wholeness. The thoughts that embarrass you, the impulses that seem inappropriate, the aspects of yourself that you most want to change. These may be communications from your inferior function, attempting to balance the overdeveloped aspects of your personality. But receiving these communications requires abandoning the fantasy of psychological perfection in favor of psychological authenticity. This abandonment is terrifying for the ego, which has built its entire identity around being competent, consistent, and socially acceptable. To acknowledge the validity of inferior thoughts and impulses feels like psychological suicide, a dissolution of everything you have worked to become. But Jung discovered that this death is not destruction, but transformation, the dissolution of false unity in service of genuine wholeness. The process is similar to what happens when you finally acknowledge a truth you have been avoiding. Initially, there is panic, disorientation, the feeling that everything you thought you knew about yourself is collapsing. But gradually, as you learn to live with this expanded understanding, you discover that you have not become less than you were. You have become more complete, more real, more capable of authentic relationship with yourself and others. This expansion of self-awareness inevitably affects your relationship to the thoughts of others as well. When you recognize the multiplicity within your own psyche, when you understand how autonomous complexes and archetypal patterns influence mental processes, you begin to perceive these same dynamics operating in everyone around you. The person who consistently irritates you may be possessed by a complex that has nothing to do with their conscious intentions. The family member who always triggers your anger may be unconsciously expressing an archetypal pattern that connects to unresolved issues in your own psyche. The colleague whose behavior seems inexplicably irrational may be caught in the grip of psychological forces they do not understand. This recognition can generate either compassion or cynicism, depending on your level of psychological development. If you use this understanding to feel superior to others, to excuse yourself from genuine relationship, or to manipulate people through their unconscious patterns, you have missed the point entirely. But if you use this awareness to develop greater empathy and more skillful communication, you begin to participate consciously in the collective healing that our world desperately needs. Jung believed that individual psychological development is not a private luxury, but a contribution to the evolution of consciousness itself. Every person who becomes more conscious of their own psychological patterns, who learns to relate skillfully to their autonomous complexes and archetypal contents, makes it slightly easier for others to do the same. This is because consciousness, like unconsciousness, is contagious. When you interact with someone who has done significant inner work, who can remain centered while psychological storms rage around them, something in you responds to that stability. You may not understand what you are perceiving, but some part of your psyche recognizes the possibility of greater psychological freedom and begins to move in that direction. Conversely, when you interact with someone who is completely possessed by unconscious contents, who projects their unresolved psychological material onto everyone around them, you may find yourself becoming reactive, defensive, or emotionally destabilized. Their unconsciousness activates corresponding patterns in your own psyche, creating a field of mutual possession that serves no one's development. Understanding these dynamics does not make you immune to them, but it does give you options. Instead of unconsciously absorbing the psychological contents that others project onto you, you can learn to recognize projection when it occurs and respond from your center rather than reacting from your complexes. This capacity for conscious response rather than unconscious reaction is one of the most practical gifts of depth psychological work. It allows you to navigate difficult relationships without losing your psychological equilibrium, to engage with challenging people without being dragged into their unconscious patterns, to offer genuine presence without sacrificing your essential boundaries. But developing this capacity requires ongoing vigilance because the tendency toward unconscious reaction is deeply ingrained in human psychology. It is far easier to blame others for your emotional responses than to examine what within your own psyche is being activated by their behavior. It is more comfortable to assume that your thoughts and feelings are straightforward responses to external circumstances than to investigate the complex psychological processes that shape your perceptions. This investigation is the work of a lifetime. Jung himself, despite decades of psychological exploration, continued to discover new layers of unconscious material right up until his death. The psyche's capacity for self-deception is virtually infinite. Its ability to hide uncomfortable truths behind comfortable illusions is endlessly creative. But this is not cause for despair. It is cause for humility and wonder. The fact that consciousness can never fully comprehend the unconscious does not mean that the relationship between them cannot deepen and mature. Like any important relationship, the connection between conscious and unconscious awareness can become more skillful, more trusting, more creative over time. This maturation transforms not only your inner life, but your entire relationship to existence itself. When you recognize that your thoughts emerge from sources both personal and transpersonal, both individual and collective, you begin to understand your life as participation in something far larger than your personal story. The challenges you face, the gifts you offer, the relationships you form, the work you do in the world, all of these become expressions of archetypal patterns that extend far beyond your individual circumstances. You are simultaneously the author of your choices and the vehicle through which larger forces express themselves, the creator of your destiny and the servant of purposes you may never fully understand. This paradox cannot be resolved through intellectual analysis, but it can be lived with increasing wisdom and grace as you learn to navigate the relationship between personal will and transpersonal guidance, between conscious intention and unconscious wisdom. You develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to participate consciously in the mysterious process through which new possibilities emerge from the creative tension between opposites. This function operates not only within your individual psyche, but in your relationships, your work, your creative endeavors, and your contribution to the collective healing of human consciousness. It is the mechanism through which the impossible becomes possible, through which stuck situations suddenly reveal unexpected solutions, through which dead ends transform into doorways. But accessing this function requires surrendering the illusion that you can control the process through which transformation occurs. You can create conditions that favor the emergence of new possibilities. You can maintain conscious awareness during periods of uncertainty and change. You can choose to engage with psychological contents skillfully rather than unconsciously. But you cannot manufacture the moments of insight, inspiration, and integration that mark genuine psychological development. These moments come as gifts, unexpected, unearned, emerging from depths you cannot fathom through processes you cannot control. Your role is not to create them, but to recognize them when they appear, and to respond with the courage and wisdom necessary to embody their implications in your actual life. This embodiment is where psychological insight becomes psychological transformation. It is one thing to understand intellectually that your thoughts arise from multiple sources within the psyche. It is quite another to live from this understanding moment by moment, allowing it to inform how you speak, how you choose, how you relate to yourself and others. The gap between understanding and embodiment is where most psychological work either succeeds or fails. You can spend years analyzing your patterns, exploring your dreams, dialoguing with your complexes, but until these insights begin to manifest as changes in your actual behavior, they remain merely interesting ideas rather than transformative realities. So here we arrive at the threshold, not of comfortable resolution, but of perpetual awakening. Everything we have explored, Every layer of autonomous complexity we have uncovered, every archetypal pattern we have named, now demands not your agreement, but your lived participation. For you see, Jung's most radical discovery was not simply that your thoughts are not entirely your own, but that recognizing this multiplicity is the beginning of true psychological sovereignty. The voices that speak through your consciousness will not disappear because you have named them. The complexes that think your thoughts will not dissolve because you have understood their origins. The archetypal currents that move through your psyche will not cease because you have mapped their patterns. But something far more profound becomes possible. Conscious collaboration with the very forces that have been unconsciously controlling you. This is the paradox that Jung lived and died exploring. That freedom comes not from controlling the contents of consciousness, but from developing a mature relationship with their source. The thoughts you cannot trust become the very threshold through which authentic selfhood emerges. Not the small self that believes it thinks its own thoughts, but the larger self that can witness all thoughts without being possessed by any single voice. And so I leave you with this recognition. Every thought that disturbs your comfortable assumptions, every impulse that threatens your carefully constructed identity, every voice that speaks from the shadows of your psyche, these are not obstacles to overcome, but invitations to explore. They are the raw materials from which genuine individuation is forged, the very chaos from which new order emerges. The question is no longer whether you can trust your thoughts, but whether you can trust yourself to engage consciously with the mystery from which all thoughts arise. This engagement is not a destination, but a way of living, awake to the multiplicity within, responsive to the wisdom of the depths, and courageously authentic in a world that rewards unconscious conformity. Jung's shocking truth becomes your daily practice, to live as one who knows that consciousness is not a possession, but a participation, not a fortress, but a dancing ground where the known and unknown meet in eternal creative tension.